This is the most dangerous prisoner in the world, and you'll never believe why. A little girl named Shiloh was on her phone at night when she got a call from a mysterious number. And on that night, she didn't pick up the phone because her parents weren't home, and she didn't want to talk to any strangers. Thinking it might be one of her friends from school or her teacher, she picked up the phone. And when she picked up the phone, she heard a little girl's voice. The little girl told Shiloh to come to the park at night alone, and told her that she would play with her. Not knowing better, Shiloh decided to leave her house and walk to the park. The time was now 1 a.m. as Shiloh slowly started walking at night to the park. No one was around except her, and it was eerily quiet. Shiloh quickly realized that there was no one around her, so she freaked out and called the number back again. But this time, no one picked up. She was so scared she just wanted to see someone, so she decided to run to the park to see her friend that called. And that's when Shiloh's heart started beating really fast, because she heard a small car parked up behind her. And what happens next will absolutely shock you. If you want to know what happens, like and follow for part 2.
Right, so my husband and I are pretty sure that we're living in a simulation. The neighborhood we moved into last year.
No, but why have I recently heard so many people say we're living in a simulation? So this creator says she thinks that certain things in her new neighborhood are just on a loop. Like neighbors that are out for walks will just stay in one place for hours. But another glitch I've heard of recently are objects that just look strange. Like the story of the guy who was home with his family one night when he just thought his lamp looked strange. Like everything else in his house was normal and his family was fine, but he looked over at his lamp and it just looked wrong, almost like it was 2D. So he just kept looking at his lamp like, what the hell is going on? And then it clicked. He gets this overwhelming sensation that the lamp is not real. And as he thinks this to himself, he wakes up. And he's on the pavement and there's paramedics over him. And they're telling him he was in this horrible accident and they have to load him into the ambulance. And he comes to find out that everything in his life is different. His family doesn't exist. He's a totally different guy. And the doctor tells him that sometimes with head injuries, you can imagine stuff when you pass out. But he always kind of felt like he realized his last simulation was fake and got booted into another one. But I don't know, what do you think?
So this murdered Texas couple's missing baby has finally been found after 42 years. And the story is crazy. Let's take a look. So in 1981, Dean Klaus, his wife Tina Lynn, and their baby Holly disappeared without a trace in East Texas. The only clue was from an anonymous caller who said that he had found Dean's car in California. And he claimed that 3 women in white robes drove it from Texas to California. Police were actually able to track down one of the women who called herself Sister Susan, and she claimed that Dean had joined a cult and renounced all earthly possessions. And she wouldn't tell them anything else. It actually wasn't until late last year that human remains found around the same time were confirmed to be Dean and Tina's. Dean had been beaten to death and Tina had been strangled. But that didn't answer what happened to Holly. This year, investigators were searching for human remains around where Dean and Tina were found. And that's when they got a genetics hit that Holly was alive and in Oklahoma. But get this, when they were talking to Holly, they found out that she had been left on the steps of a church in Arizona by none other than 3 women in white robes. Investigation is still pending, and they are really trying to figure out who these white-robed women are. But for now, at least we know that Holly is alive and well.
Have you ever heard of America's first serial killer? Herman Webster moved to Chicago in 1885 and actually ironically changed his name to H.H. Holmes after, you guessed it, Sherlock Holmes, the detective. Holmes had quite a bit of medical knowledge, so he opened up a pharmacy near Jackson Park, which actually became the spot of the World's Fair, where he ended up finding a majority of his victims. Holmes purchased an empty lot and turned it into what is known as the Murder Castle. Holmes created this so-called castle with booby traps and a complete labyrinth that made it almost impossible for any of his victims to ever escape. This murder castle had soundproof rooms, booby traps, and trap doors that would even drop you unsuspectedly down into the basement. And once you made it into the basement, you never made it back out. Inside the basement was acid vats, quicklime, and a crematorium for him to easily and quickly dispose of any of the bodies. But Holmes finally made a mistake when he murdered his assistant and his few children, but the police actually ended up finding the body of one of these children, leading to Holmes' arrest. Once arrested, Holmes claimed to have murdered over 200 people over the span of just a few years inside this murder castle. He even went on to write a book about himself, and in it he wrote, "I cannot help that I am a murderer no more than a poet can help the inspiration to sing." Finally, Holmes was hanged for his crimes in 1896.
a lot of people haven't tagged me in this video, so I'm here to explain the backstory to this whole thing. The man you see in this video is named Kyle Morgan. Now, Kyle was a mentally ill individual. He suffered a lot with drug addiction and depression in his early teenage years. His father states that he started getting addicted to drugs and alcohol at a young age. His father also states that he suffered from depression and would often cut himself, at one point even trying to commit slip and slide at the age of 16. This led Morgan's parents to send him to facilities to get him rehabilitated. Now, he would come out okay, but after a few weeks or a few months, he would fall right back where he started. This would lead us to January 18th, 2009. Morgan was at a train station where he met a homeless person by the name of Robin Burton Jr. They both struck up a conversation and decided to go to Chicago to get drugs. When this failed, Morgan offered the man to come to his apartment and promised him a warm shelter for the night. When they both got into the apartment, everything was okay. They started playing video games and drinking beer. That's when Morgan pulled out a hammer and struck Barton in the head. Barton's body was eventually found by a maintenance man working in the apartment complex, and the police was immediately called. When they entered the apartment, they found such a horrifying scene. They found Barton's body with over 30 stab wounds. He also had Uno cards stacked on his chest with the number 666 on it. Aside from that, he had a crossbone dice on his temple. In the apartment, they also found a DVD player with the movie Natural Born Killers in it. They also found writings on the walls that said, "It's better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven," written with Barton's blood. They found Morgan not too long after when he crashed his car into a tree. He was arrested and pleaded guilty, and he was sentenced to 30 years in prison for first-degree murder. Like and follow for more.
I spent 2 days in a Texas prison with one of the most notorious killers in America. And y'all, those 2 days started 10 years of living hell for me. I've shared parts of this story before on TikTok, but I'm going to go into some details that I haven't shared before and the long-term effects that it has had on me. I was working one time with this inmate, and she was 17 years old, had been tried and convicted as an adult. She was in an adult prison for masterminding and participating in the slaughter of her entire family. Her dad was the lone survivor, but unfortunately her mother and 2 younger brothers did not survive the attack. And this weekend, as I'm working with her, I had never met her before and I had not heard her story, and so she was able to take me for a ride, basically telling me the version of the story that she wanted me to hear. And what I didn't know is that she is a psychopath. And she was getting sick pleasure out of toying with me, watching my emotional responses, and just seeing what she could get away with. And I was totally sucked in. I totally was buying everything she was telling me. And I felt pretty safe around her because she was a small, petite person. But the moment that everything in the room changed was whenever she was looking down. She really wasn't even looking at me. She was just kind of looking down and talking real soft like this. And all of a sudden, she just does this. And y'all, when she looked up at me that way, there was a black darkness in her eyes that I have never seen in anybody before, and it scared the shit out of me. I suddenly felt extremely vulnerable, like I was in a predatory environment and I was not safe. I was clearly shaken. I finished my work, got out of there, but I had to come back the next day to work with her for a second day. And this second day that I worked with her, I'm coming into the same prison space that we were working in the day before, and I see her from a distance, and what I saw still shakes me to this day. Now, you're going to think I'm crazy or that I'm one of those religious kooky people that constantly hallucinates like demonic spiritual things. I'm not. I'm not the kind of person who sees things, but this day I saw something. I'm looking at this girl from down a ways, and she looks at me and her face just goes hollow. Her eyes go black and sunken in, almost like I'm looking at a skeletal version of her. And the only thing that I can explain it is that maybe there was something evil around her that almost was standing between me and her, and I was seeing through this thing. And it was a way of me seeing that there is evil around her and that I need to be cautious. But y'all listen, this 2-day weekend with her started 10 years of nightmares, panic attacks, sleep paralysis, seeing shadow figures in my room. To this day, I have had hauntings and unexplained poltergeists in every place I've lived. I'm talking about things being knocked into the floor, things being knocked off of shelves, hearing people crawling around in my living room at night when I'm sleeping in the bedroom above. I wasn't much of a believer in the paranormal before I worked with her, but trust me, it made a believer out of me.
I don't know if you guys heard about this case, the Carly Russell abduction case. I heard about it over the weekend, and I'm shook because I did not think it was going to go this way. I am a true crime fan, and I was following every single news source about this woman because I felt so bad. On July 13th, Carly called the police and claimed that there was a missing toddler on the side of the highway. She was encouraged to slow down and stay with the child until police arrived on the scene. While she slowed down on the side of the road and stopped, she was on the phone with one of her family members, and they claimed they heard a woman screaming and then nothing. So all weekend, people were worried about this woman, trying to find out where she was. And I was especially invested just because this is a tactic heavily used in Kenya, where you see a pregnant woman on the side of the road or a child in distress and you slow down to help them, and that's how they get you. But I'd never heard about this happening in the States. So people were looking everywhere for this woman, wondering where she could have gone, worried about her. And with the way true crimers and TikTok is these days, you can search worldwide. People were looking for this girl worldwide, but especially in the state of Alabama. Fast forward to 2 days later, Carly returns home and we get zero information, but everyone is just so relieved that she's okay. The police don't speak, her family's not speaking out. They say that they need time to process, which is understandable. Her boyfriend, who calls himself T. Sims on Instagram, made a post stating that Carly had been fighting for her life for 48 hours and we needed to give them time to process what was happening. Then we started seeing reports that her story of what actually happened to her wasn't adding up. So let's get into what she said. The day Carly went missing, police arrived on the scene and said that they found her phone, her wig. Like, they snatched her wig, girl. They snatched her wig and a few of her other items, but Carly was nowhere to be seen. Also, the toddler on the side of the highway, gone. Carly said that day, while she was going to approach the toddler, a man came out with orange hair and a balding spot at the back and threw her into an 18-wheeler truck. There was a man, a woman, and a child in this 18-wheeler truck, and they took her to an unknown location. They did not tie her up, and they only blindfolded her, and the woman fed her cheese crackers. She says that she thinks that they took pictures of her naked, but nothing else happened to her while she was abducted. She said she was able to escape, make it through the woods, and come out close to her house. Once she got home, the police interviewed her, but they didn't want to interview her further because she was in distress at the time. That's all we knew for a long time, until now. While the police conducted their search, they noticed a few things were off. These terms were found on Carly's private browsing history. These are terms she searched in the days leading up to her abduction. I hate to be that guy, but I've run out of time. Please go to part 2.
So this is death row inmate Taylor Parker, who went to extreme lengths to cover up her lies. She even killed a pregnant woman in order to steal the baby from her womb just to prove she was really pregnant. So picture here we have Taylor and her boyfriend Wade, and what appears to be a baby bump. What later is found out is just an actual prosthetic baby bump, not a real one. She was covering up this entire time, pretending to be pregnant so that Wade would not leave her. Now, she couldn't have gotten pregnant because she had a hysterectomy several years earlier, but Wade was unaware of this. Well, that's where Reagan comes into play, because Reagan actually was pregnant around the same time that Taylor said she was pregnant. And she knew Reagan because she had been a photographer at Reagan's wedding. Now, Taylor's perpetrating this lie the entire time, so even holding a gender reveal party and going to ultrasound, sending fake images to her boyfriend. He never gets to go into the doctor's office. She keeps telling him, oh, sorry, it's COVID. You're not allowed to go back there. So he begins to grow a little suspicious of the whole thing, especially after when the day she was supposed to be induced, his house catches on fire and a bomb threat at the hospital they were supposed to be induced at occurs. And then she becomes 3 weeks late on her pregnancy. That's when Wade's mother pulls him aside and says, I actually think you're onto something. She's probably not pregnant. Wade confronts her once again about the whole thing, and she says, watch, I'm going to get induced at a hospital in Oklahoma, and you will see. So Friday, she sets up an appointment to be induced. So that morning, Wade actually goes to a hog sale because he was supposed to go down to this sale about 4 hours from their house, come back, drive her to the hospital, and watch the baby be induced. Well, ends up being that he goes there, and it was a false. She had set this up for him to actually go to this hog hunt so she could go see Reagan and murder her, and she does. Sadly, she goes over to her friend's house, attacks her, stabs her with a scalpel that she had over 100 times while her little daughter is standing right there. Then she cuts open her stomach and extracts the baby from it and rushes towards the hospital. She gets pulled over for speeding and says, "Hey, look, I just had this baby. It's unresponsive. Help me, help me." She had actually tucked the umbilical cord into her pants to make it look like the baby was still attached to her. But the hospital staff begins to grow suspect as she refuses to be checked at all, and the baby shows up dead, and they actually heard that there was a baby that was abducted from another murder victim after the mother of Reagan showed up and found her daughter with hundreds of stab wounds. Sadly, at court, all this web of lies comes out. Reagan and the baby were killed. She was sentenced to murder and sentenced to death in Texas, where she currently sits on death row awaiting execution.
Three dead bodies were found stuffed into this hollowed-out tree in the middle of the woods in 2010. And when it came to who the murderer was, truth is stranger than fiction. This is Matthew Hoffman, and in November of 2010, he murdered 3 people and kidnapped a 13-year-old girl who he held hostage for days. On November 9th, 2010, Matthew went into the woods and spent the night camping. Then the next morning, on November 10th, he decided to wake up and break into the home of Tina Herman. So, unfortunately that day, when Tina Herman returned to her house, Matthew Hoffman had broken in. And as soon as he saw her, he freaked out, dragged her into a bedroom, and stabbed her multiple times with a hunting knife, killing her. But what Matthew didn't know was that Tina's friend Stephanie was coming over to meet her that morning. And while Matthew was dealing with Tina and her dead body, Stephanie entered the residence. Matthew freaked out. He stabbed Stephanie a number of times with the same hunting knife, even continuing to stab her after she was dead. And hearing all of this, the family's dog started to bark violently, and Matthew then stabbed and killed the family dog as well. After this, he dragged both of the women's bodies into the bathroom, dismembered them in the tub along with the body of the dog, and stuffed their body parts into trash bags. Shortly after finishing the dismemberment process, though, Tina's 2 children, Cody and Sarah, arrived home from school. Immediately after walking into their house, Matthew stabbed Cody in the back of the head, killing him instantly, then chased Sarah up into her room where he bound and gagged her with a cord from a fan in her room. So after dismembering Cody's body and stuffing him into a trash bag as well, Matthew brought out the 3 bodies that he had chopped up and placed into garbage bags, stored them in his car, and then brought out Sarah, who was still alive. After this, he brought Sarah and the bodies of Tina, Stephanie, and Cody back to his own house, where he kept Tina locked in a crawl space. And this is where the story gets really weird. So Matthew Hoffman was a self-professed tree lover, and his entire home was covered in leaves. I'm talking about piles of leaves, bags of leaves nailed to the walls. And apparently, according to his neighbors at the time, Matthew had exhibited some really strange behavior prior to the murders. He had apparently been trapping squirrels in his backyard, killing them and grilling them. He allegedly spent hours sitting up in the trees in his backyard, just staring at the other trees and watching squirrels. And for a while, he had actually worked as a professional tree trimmer. But let's get back to the story. So after bringing Sarah back to his house, along with the bodies of the other people he had killed, he locked her in a bathroom and even tied himself to her and took a nap. Afterwards, he headed back to the crime scene, did some cleanup, and then eventually brought Sarah into a crawl space, which was once again covered in leaves, dark and damp. And while she was chained up and held hostage inside of this crawl space, for days he visited her regularly and would SA her. Keep in mind, at the time, Sarah was only 13 years old, and her mom, her brother, and her family friend had been murdered right in front of her. Finally, though, a few days later, Matthew was arrested after police found him parked in his own car right next to the abandoned car of one of his victims. Tina, Coda, Sarah, and Stephanie had been missing for days now, so the police obviously went and searched Matthew's house, and that's when they made the gruesome discovery of Sarah chained up in the crawl space. This is an actual photo that the police released eventually of Sarah exactly as they found her. They actually had to take these photos for evidence before they released her, and they obviously immediately arrested Matthew. So for a while after his arrest, Matthew would not release the location of the bodies to the police. They were desperately trying to find the bodies of those people that he had killed, but he wouldn't tell them anything. That is, until they took the death penalty off the table, and that's when he revealed that he had stuffed the 3 corpses into a hollowed-out tree in the middle of the woods. Police immediately then went and found the tree, and inside they found the bodies of Cody, Stephanie, and Tina in those trash bags, dismembered. Eventually, the tree was torn down, but, how bizarre is this story? Eventually, Matthew Hoffman was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and this whole story is just kind of mind-blowing. He's been nicknamed the Leaf Killer for doing the things that he did, for his obsession with leaves, the way that he placed the bodies inside of a hollowed-out tree trunk. I've never really heard a story like this, and I hope to never hear one like this again.
What? Look in there, mate. Look in there. What? Look in there.
Now, a lot of people have been tagging me in this video, so I'm here to explain the backstory to this whole thing. Now, bear with me, this is a very graphic and long breakdown of this whole thing. Now, the little girl you see in this video is named Sandra Canto, who was born on March 8th, 2001. Her parents were named Maria Chavez and Daniel Canto. She lived in a trailer park with her parents, her grandparents, and her 3 older siblings in Tracy, California. Now, Sandra was a really happy, bubbly girl, and she was also very talkative, so she would strike up a conversation with almost everyone. And she was also very helpful around the neighborhood. But things would take a dark turn on March 27, 2009. Sandra had just come back from school, and she was very energetic and happy. So she asked her mother if she could play outside with her friends. Now, in the neighborhood, it's normal for kids to play outside in the park spaces or in their friends' houses, so her mother said yes. Sandra then proceeded to go skipping happily to her friend's house, knocking on their houses. That was the last time Maria saw her daughter alive. It was getting pretty late, and Sandra had not come home yet.
What, she didn't come home for dinner? Or she didn't call me?
Maria was getting worried, so she called Sandra's friends and asked if they seen her. Her friends said that they haven't seen her for hours. Eventually, the police was involved and ordered a search, and even went as far as to offer $20,000 for whoever can find Sandra Canto. At this exact time, Maria had received a text message from her neighbor Melissa McCumchie, something like that. I'm not pronouncing that last name. She had texted her, quote, "Tell the police I lost a suitcase. Don't know if this makes it different or not." Back in the town, they were holding candles and praying for Sandra's safety when all of a sudden a woman burst out crying and screaming and telling the police that she had found a note on her front yard. The note said, and I quote, "Cantu locked in stolen suitcase, thrown in water on Bachetti Road and Whitehall Road, witness." Now, this was very off because the note had obvious spelling mistakes, and the woman who reported finding this note was the same woman who texted Maria about the suitcase. Up until this point, they didn't suspect Melissa of anything because she was a mother and she was a Sunday school teacher. Why would she do something like this? Eventually, a farm worker who was walking down that same water path that the note said found the suitcase and called the police. And as expected, Sandra's body was found inside the suitcase. Forensic evidence shows that she had been beaten with a foreign object and smothered to death. They also found traces of Xanax in her system. The police checked security cameras and found that Sandra was making her way to Melissa's house and Melissa leaving in her SUV. Earlier that day, Melissa claimed that she went to the church at 5 and came home at 6:30 p.m. Police investigated the church and found a rolling pin with a bent handle and a brownish reddish stain on the side. The stain tested positive for Sandra's DNA. Now, when they went to arrest Melissa tried to unalive herself by swallowing a razor to avoid consequences for her actions. But she made a recovery in the hospital and was quickly discharged. After she was discharged, the police then arrested her and interrogated her. Melissa said that the whole thing was an accident, and she said that Sandra climbed in the suitcase because she was playing hide and seek with her daughter. Melissa didn't know Sandra was hiding in the suitcase and closed it up anyways, and Sandra died of asphyxiation. Melissa was tried and almost given the death penalty, but however, she pleaded guilty and received life in prison without parole. During the whole court trial, Sandra's father burst out crying and said this:
"You took the life of an innocent little girl, and she didn't do nothing. She's not even old enough to decide to eat ice cream yet."
Now, the reason Melissa did this is still unknown. Melissa doesn't even know why she did the whole thing.
I wish I could give you an explanation for what happened. I owe you an explanation. I still cannot understand why I did what I did.
Like and follow for more.
Of the emergency.
My daughter is missing.
What's your address, ma'am?
She's gone. We can't find her anywhere. I've called all her friends.
How old is she?
11.
Okay, what's her name, ma'am?
Carly, C-A-R-L-I-E.
And last name?
Brucia, B-R-U-C-I-A.
The footage you just watched shows the last known moments of 11-year-old Carly Brucia as she was abducted in broad daylight by a violent predator. Despite being reported missing by her parents within half an hour of her disappearance, Carly's case would ultimately go down in history as one of the most depraved crimes against a young girl. It all started on January 31st, 2004. Carly had spent the night at a friend's house, but the following day was Super Bowl Sunday, so she wanted to get back home in time to watch the game. She told her friend's mother that she was allowed to make the walk back home on her own and departed around 6 p.m. However, after she left, the concerned parent reached out to Carly's mother, Susan, and informed her that Carly was walking the mile back home alone. Susan said she didn't feel comfortable with her daughter walking even just a few blocks alone, so she sent her husband and Carly's stepfather, Steve Kanzler, to find Carly and drive her the rest of the way home. However, as Steve went up and down the route Carly would have walked, he couldn't find her anywhere, and that's when the nightmare really began. Steve continued to drive around for over an hour, praying that he had somehow simply missed Carly, but when he returned home and she still wasn't there, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. Susan later said of this moment that she instantly felt something terrible had happened to Carly, saying, "In my heart, in my mind, I knew." Susan and Steve left the house together to search again, shouting Carly's name out the car window as they drove down the road. They stopped briefly to investigate a wooded area and noticed a red tow truck drive slowly by them. Then they continued retracing Carly's steps and went to her friend's house to check there. And much to their surprise, they saw the same red truck parked out front. It struck them both as very odd, and upon realizing that Carly wasn't there either, Susan decided it was time to call for help. The frantic mother dialed 911 around 7:30 that evening. She couldn't hide the absolute terror in her voice.
911, what's the location of the emergency?
My daughter is missing.
What's your address, ma'am? And your phone number? Okay. Has she been missing before?
No, she had a fight with her girlfriend. She decided to walk home, and we've been driving around for about an hour and a half. And it's now an hour and a half walk. She's gone. We can't find her anywhere. I've called all her friends.
How old is she?
11.
And when was the last time that she was seen?
It was at 6 o'clock, Jean. Around 6 o'clock.
And she was at a friend's house?
Yeah.
Okay, what's her name, ma'am?
Carly, C-A-R-L-I-E.
And last name?
Brucia, B-R-U-C-I-A. She's just shy of 5 feet.
Okay. Do you know how much she weighs?
She's around 120 pounds.
Okay, what color hair does she have?
Dirty blonde.
And what color eyes?
Blue.
Following the heartbreaking call, police immediately issued a BOLO, or Be on the Lookout alert for Carly, and searched the surrounding area for 4.5 hours, but found nothing. Meanwhile, Carly's family and friends got to work creating missing persons flyers with her face on them, and they began handing them out the next morning. But something happened during this time that struck a few people as suspicious. Carly's stepfather, Steve, allegedly visited a local equipment rental business to hand out flyers and asked one of the employees if he could purchase drugs in a couple of days after this whole thing blew over. The employee thought it was a very odd thing to say when his stepdaughter was missing, so he contacted the authorities. Detectives also felt that something was off with Steve, so they brought him in for questioning. He stated that he'd been at home the entire time with Susan, which she was able to corroborate. After fully verifying his alibi, he was cleared as a suspect, but Steve did offer them another name, Ron Choquette. Ron was the owner of the red tow truck, and he'd apparently been dating the mother of Carly's friend for 2 months. He was home the night Carly slept over, and at one point, he was the only adult present. So naturally, Steve informed police about how he'd noticed Ron's red truck